Alright, guys. So, I'm back with a second video. So this is going to be scripting, just the basic tutorial as far as just events. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I have just a blank script here. And what you can do is if you select it, you have these three little dots at the top where if you go that way, this is a scripting terminal. And this doesn't have to necessarily be attached to something directly. When you go to an object itself, for instance, if I grab, let's say this object right here, and I do the same thing, the three little dots, down at the bottom it says attached script, and you can click on this and you can click one of the other scripts that are somewhere out in the world, and you can see I have several of them set out here, and I'll show you here in just a second kind of how they're set up. So for the most part, each one of these are set to move that circle, that ball, somewhere within the world. Now, we'll go over movement here in a little bit in maybe another video. That's going to be this little tab right here, whether it's instant motion, motion over time, and so on. Again, don't want to get into this too much. I'm more interested in just this first tab. So this first tab is basically what causes an effect to happen. So for instance, when world is started, and that's always going to be at the start of your script. So let's say you want music to start automatically, or you want something to move from place to place automatically once you load into the world. Well, in that case, I would click move over time, and this would be right under when world is started. And then when the world is started, that would automatically happen. Well, we can delete that and go back to events. And there's other things here too. So there is when event is received. So that's kind of like a wireless transmission, and we can go through that. When trigger is entered by object, exited by object, or when trigger is entered by player or exited by player. So with the trigger entering, what I did was I actually created this little trigger here, and you can find that. There we are. You can find that in your menu down here. And when you go to Gizmo, your triggers are right here. And when you pull this out, you would get this pretty little green block. So that's the trigger that we're talking about here. So let's go back to our script. And so when trigger is entered by an object, exited by an object, or entered by player, exited by player, you're telling it, do I want it to activate whatever the script that's attached to it is by hitting it with another piece, another block, or do I want every time somebody touches it for that to do its action? Um, and then going on from there, we have when colliding with object or when colliding with player. So this is the same thing. The only difference is instead of needing a trigger inside of a space, you don't need a trigger. You just need something to interact with another object, and we'll cover that here in just a moment as well. The next item here is when object is grabbed by player. So we'll go through that. When it's released by player, when object is grabbed by two hands, when object is no longer grabbed by two hands, so you can still be grabbing it by one, but as long as two hands aren't on it at the same time, it'll activate whatever happens when that happens there. When an object is attached to a player or unattached to the player, we're not going to necessarily cover that in this video here, but that's more if you have a helmet that you want to let the player put on, or a shirt or something that you want them to put on. When they attach that outfit, does it give them certain abilities? Does it cause a door to open? What happens there? And then when index trigger is pressed and when index trigger is released, so that's on your actual hand. So I actually made a little controller down here that we're going to go through here in a little bit, but this is the trigger. When it talks about index trigger, this is going to be the trigger on, let's say, a remote control, an Oculus remote. When button 1 is pressed or released, so that's going to be this button right here. So if you push it, it causes one thing to happen. If you let it go, it causes something else to happen. And then button 2 is pressed and released. Same thing, except now you're looking at button 2. And then send event to object. So that is the equivalent to this when event is received. So this, send event to object, you can cause something to send something wirelessly to another block, and then when that block gets that code, it gets that activation, it causes something else to happen. And we're going to go through that here in a second as well. Send event with delay. It's the same thing to send event. The only difference is, let's say you click a button and let's say you're making a bomb and you want it to explode, but when you click that button, you want it to wait 3 seconds before it actually explodes. So this is where you're going to use the event with delay, and you can't actually use that because you need an action. So you need something to cause the event to send with the delay. And as you can see, 1 second, you can change this to 3 seconds, for however many you want. Cancel sending with delay, so if you do that and then this is sending here in 5 seconds, well, you can cause something to stop this from sending overall. So overall, those are just a quick setup as far as what the scripts are. So now what do they do? So here's the trigger, and what we did was we have a script on each one of these objects, and just for this purpose here, I'll show you what it looks like. So when trigger is entered, so that's when this little green place is entered by a player, it will move the block to this vector. Now, we're not going to go into that because we'll cover that in another video, but I just wanted you to see kind of how the basic makeup is. And then when the trigger, this trigger block here, is exited by the player, it will move to this. So that's kind of the idea with the different things. So if I put my hand in this, it's already where the point it wants to be at, but then if I pull my hand out, it'll move to where I want it to be. And then in, and then out. I'm not grabbing anything, I'm not doing anything, all I'm doing is touching that and letting it go. And it's that simple. The other item is the collision code that we were looking at. So it's the same thing as the trigger code we looked at. The only difference is now we're using that collision script that we were looking at in the original block. So if I grab this and I touch this, it'll go up to that next place. And so the reason I'm touching this, if you notice, is just to reset it, because the collision, it only activates one way. There's no uncollision code. So no matter what I do, it's only going to do one thing. And you can change that by making a switch, which is going to take a lot of other things, and I bring up switch, but for the most part, again, that's going to be something a little more complex we'll cover later. But for the most part, you just want to know when this block hits this block, it will cause that to react to that. In this case here, this doesn't care what hits it, what touches it. What it cares about is whether or not you grab it. So if I grab it, it'll cause an action to happen. And then if I ungrab it, it'll cause the next action to happen. So that's the basics of when a player grabs the object or releases the object. Then we come to the two-handed. So I can do everything I want with this, it's not going to do anything. But as soon as I take a second hand and grab it with the second hand, you can see it does that action. When I let go with one hand, and I don't have to let go with two, if I let go with one hand, I'm no longer handling it with two hands, it'll send that script up. So that's a cool little thing if you want to create a kind of a secret puzzle or something like that. And then this is one of my favorites that I've created a lot of things with. So right now, if I click the trigger, this button here, it goes to this position. If I click the A button right there, it moves to that position. And then if I click the B button, it goes there. So you can see, as I click different buttons, I can get it to go back and forth between those two spaces. I can get it to go to those spaces there. And so that's all with those when button 1 is pressed, when button 2 is pressed, and when trigger index is pressed. And that's what that'll do. And this you can think of as just one block. I've made it to where you can kind of see what I'm pushing on. That way you kind of have a better idea. And then this last couple objects here, these are going to be the send event. So let's say you want this to be over here, but you want this block to be over somewhere else. And actually, I didn't make it grabbable, so that is one problem we're going to have. But let's go ahead and fix that here. So under behavior, I'm going to make interactive and grabbable, and we're going to cover this in another video for the most part. I just want to get the kind of the gist of everything covered. That way we can get into more elaborate creations. So this one here, if I grab it, it'll send event 1 to that block. when I grab this, it'll send event 2. And as you can see, this does nothing except for send one event. So I have to have this block. Or this one sends a different event and I have to have this block. Unlike these ones where you can do one or the other, where I can grab it, let go, grab it, and all of it's controlled by one block. So it's a little different. It's a little cool just for the fact, let's say you want to make a gate where the outside of the gate, you have a button that opens it, and then on the inside of the gate, you can click another button and that'll close the gate. I know I did it backwards there, but you get the gist of the idea. Um, Real quick, I do want to just go through the scripting as well now that we know what each project does. And I'm sorry, I'm talking and I'm not taking a breath there. So trigger, what I did was I made this script, and as you can see, when trigger enters with player, it goes to a certain vector, and when trigger exits by player, it goes to a different vector. And I've named this trigger. So then, when I go to the trigger and the code is on the trigger itself, the only reason I have this is so that you can see where the trigger is, because if you go into the demo mode, you can't actually see the trigger. And so you want something to inform you where that is, or if you want something to trigger when they walk through a doorway, then that's why you'd want it invisible. So I would actually do the script on the trigger, or yeah, on the trigger, and in this case I named it trigger, and then block would tell me which object it goes to. And that's within the coding as well, and that's going to be a variable, but again, we'll color that here in a little bit, but I do want to make sure that you're aware of where everything is coming from in this video. In collision, what we'd want to go ahead and do is I have this collision script. When collision enters with object, we're going to move to a certain vector, and that's why it only moves one way, because it only knows whether you hit it. And then the way I set that up is over here, I make the object that's going to take the code and send it to that. And this is going to be the object that collides with something else. And under more, I want collision event, because again, we're talking about the events here. I want collision event to activate when the object that's tagged touches this. And you can see object tag is stick. So whatever I hit this with, unless it's tagged stick, it's not going to matter. Well, if I come back over here to my stick, under attributes, I have tag, stick, and that's what tells this block that when this object here touches this, that's when it's going to send this action to a block. And again, we'll talk about actions later. I find it very hard to talk about a script without talking about actions, but there's a little more to those that we want to cover, and I don't necessarily want to cover it all in one video. And then here is the grab script. So it's very similar as far as when grabs start, and basically what that is when the object is grabbed by a player. When you put it over here, it says grab start. That's just what it's called. So when object is grabbed by a player, it's going to do this action. But when the grab is ending, or when the object is released by player, it's going to do this action. And that's why I can grab this, it'll do one thing, and then if I let go, it'll do something else. Two-handed, this is going to be when object is grabbed by two hands, when object is no longer grabbed by two hands. So that's multi-grab start, multi-grab end, and again, you don't have to put this in. If you just grab one of these and put it over here, it'll automatically fill this in with what it needs to be. And then with player, and then the action for when it starts and when it ends. And so that's the two-handed. And then the buttons are a little trickier because now you can have multiple different interactions. So I do want to say the colors, disregard that. Basically what that's doing there is just telling me which colors are turning red. That's how I made it kind of perceivable as far as what I'm actually clicking on. So when the index trigger is pulled by the player, then this action, which makes it move, and then it changes the colors of my different triggers. When button 1 is pressed down, then it does something completely different. And then when button 2 is pressed down, it does something completely different. So you can have 3 different items put on one block and do 3 different things, whatever you want them to do. I've used this for respawning to 3 different locations or teleporting to 3 different locations off an object. In this case here, making a block go to 3 different locations, plus making 3 different items light up differently. And again, the actions we'll go through later. For the most part, I just want you to get used to where the script is coming from. And then events, this is going to be where here we are. So send event to object. So what I have it is when grabbed. So this is when the object is grabbed by player, is right here. Send event. And so that's where we get the send event to object. Send event 1 to block. And so block, if you look, here we are. So block, if you come into this object and you look at the script, and again, I just put the script send event 1 to this, send event 2 to this. This is where it's telling me that that's what it's going to send that code to. And then if you look over here, and that's not what I wanted to click, if you look over here, this is also doing it. So these are sending different events, but the different events will then turn when event 1 is received. So when event is received, and then you can name it whatever you want as long as it matches what's coming into that block. When event 1 is received, it'll do this action, and when event 2 is received, it'll do this action. And so each button has a different event attached to it. That way you can do one here and one there. 2 people can control an object if you wanted to, different things like that. I am very sorry as far as making it a little more complex than it should have been. Scripting is going to get a little harder as we go through, and for the most part, this right here is going to be the first step in any script. You cannot create an action without some type of event, which is from here. If you don't have any of these, then you can't do anything else, because the event is what's causing those other items to happen. But with that, we will end this video, and then in the next video, we'll go through more of the actions. Thank you very much for sticking with me.